Welcome, my Whispering Bee family. Today's story is about two women, one who believed she could outrun the consequences of her choices, and another who let pain turn into something far more dangerous. Clara spent years convincing herself she had life figured out, carefully avoiding real love by choosing relationships that were never meant to last. It felt safe, until she decided she wanted something more. That's when she met Jesse, the perfect man, the kind you don't question, the kind you build a future with. But some pasts don't stay buried, and some wounds don't just heal, they wait. Because while Clara thought she was finally stepping into a real, honest love, someone else was quietly rewriting her story from the shadows. And by the time the truth comes out, it won't just break her heart. It will force both women to face the cost of the choices they made. Stay with me, because this isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about consequences, the weight of past decisions, and what happens when someone else decides to make you feel the very pain you once caused. So Clara had this thing she did for 2 whole years. She only slept with married men. And I know what you're thinking, but hear me out, because her reasoning was actually kind of twisted in a way that made sense to her at the time. She was tired of getting cheated on by unmarried guys, like genuinely exhausted from it. So in her head, she figured if she's going to be the other woman anyway, might as well make it intentional. At least with married men, she knew what she was getting into. No commitments, no expectations, just something temporary. Some of these guys were exactly what she wanted. They understood the arrangement. They had their lives, she had hers, and nobody was trying to change that. But then there were the others. The ones who started catching feelings. The ones who would sit there and tell her they wanted to leave their wives for her. They'd paint these pictures of a future together, and Clara would shut it down every single time. She'd look at them and say no, because if they could cheat on their wife with her, what made them think she'd trust them? She saw right through it. 3 years after she stopped that whole phase, after a full year of what she called becoming clean, Clara thought she had it all figured out. She convinced herself that she understood men now, like really understood them. She knew their patterns, their tricks, their tells. So she started dating unmarried men again, feeling confident that she could spot the red flags from a mile away. She went on dates with a few different guys, and nothing really clicked until Jesse came along. And Jesse was something else. He had this way about him that felt different from everyone she'd met before. He was charming, but not in that over-the-top way that feels fake. He was attentive without being clingy. He had these green eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled, and when he laughed, it was this deep, genuine sound that made you want to keep making him laugh. He dressed well but casual, like he put in effort without trying too hard. And he listened. Actually listened when she talked, remembered little things she'd mentioned in passing. After a few dates, things started getting serious between them. They were having real conversations about the future, about what they both wanted out of life. And then they started talking about moving in together. The conversation came up naturally one night when they were at Jesse's apartment. Clara had been staying over more and more, and she'd left a toothbrush there, some clothes, a few books. Jesse was making them dinner, something simple with pasta and vegetables, and Clara was sitting on the counter watching him cook. He said something about how nice it was having her there, and then he stopped stirring and looked at her and asked if she'd ever thought about them living together for real. Clara's first instinct was to panic. She'd never lived with anyone before, not a boyfriend anyway. It felt like a huge step, the kind that meant you were really committing to something. But then she looked at Jesse, at the way he was watching her with this hopeful expression, and she realized she wanted it too. She wanted to wake up next to him every day, wanted to build a life with him, wanted to see if they could make it work. So she said yes, and Jesse broke into this huge grin and nearly knocked over the pot of pasta in his excitement. They spent the rest of the night talking about what kind of place they wanted, what neighborhood, how they'd split costs. It felt adult in a way that made Clara nervous, but also kind of excited. Clara remembers the day they went apartment hunting. Jesse made it fun, turning each viewing into this little adventure. The first place they saw was way too expensive, but they walked through it anyway, pretending they were millionaires. The second place smelled weird, and they both knew immediately it was a no. The third place was in a building with a super aggressive landlord who kept bragging about all the rules, and Clara could see Jesse trying not to laugh. They'd walk into a place, and he'd immediately start planning where things would go. talking about lazy Sunday mornings making breakfast together, about coming home to each other after long days. He'd test the water pressure in the shower, check the cabinet space in the kitchen, open and close windows to see if they stuck. He was thorough, but in a way that felt like he genuinely cared about finding the right place for them. They found this place in the city, nothing fancy, but it had good light and enough space for both of them. 2 bedrooms because Clara wanted one as an office, hardwood floors, a kitchen that was actually big enough to cook in. There was this weird alcove off the living room that didn't really serve a purpose, but Jessie said they could put a reading chair there and make it cozy. The windows looked out over the street, and you could see this little corner store and a coffee shop and people walking their dogs. When they signed the lease, Clara felt this rush of nervousness and excitement. This was really happening. They were moving in together, building a life together. She kept sneaking glances at Jessie while they were signing papers, and he caught her once and squeezed her hand. Moving day was chaos in the best way. Jessie's friends showed up to help. These guys he'd known for years who gave Clara a hard time in that friendly way that meant they approved of her. Clara's best friend showed up with pizza and beer, and within an hour the apartment was full of people and boxes and laughter. There were boxes everywhere, and at one point Jessie couldn't find his coffee maker and acted like it was a genuine emergency, until Clara pulled it out of a box labeled bathroom stuff. They laughed about that for weeks. One of Jessie's friends, Mike, kept making jokes about how Jessie was officially domesticated now. Jessie threw a roll of packing tape at him. Clara's best friend pulled her aside at one point and said she'd never seen Clara this happy, and Clara realized it was true. She was happy. Genuinely, completely happy in a way she couldn't remember being before. That first night in their new place, they sat on the floor because they hadn't set up the furniture yet, eating takeout Chinese food straight from the containers, and it felt perfect. The apartment was a mess, half-unpacked boxes everywhere, but they were there together, and that's what mattered. Jessie fed her a dumpling with chopsticks and missed her mouth, and it fell on the floor, and they both cracked up. They stayed up too late talking about all the things they wanted to do in this space, all the memories they'd make here. Clara fell asleep that night on an air mattress in the middle of what would be their bedroom, Jessie's arm around her, and thought, this is it. This is what everyone talks about. This is what it feels like when it's right. The months that followed were good, like really good. They fell into this rhythm together that felt effortless. Jessie would wake up first and make coffee, and Clara would stumble out of bed to find him already dressed for work, 2 mugs waiting on the counter. He'd made her coffee the way she liked it without her having to ask, remembered that she took it with just a little bit of milk and no sugar. They'd text throughout the day, stupid stuff mostly. Photos of weird things they saw on lunch breaks, complaints about coworkers who talked too loud or meetings that should have been emails, countdowns to when they'd see each other again. Jessie would send her pictures of dogs he saw on the street. Clara would send him screenshots of funny tweets. Once he sent her a photo of a cloud that he said looked like her hair in the morning, and she threatened to break up with him, and he sent back a bunch of heart emojis. Some nights they'd cook together, bumping into each other in their tiny kitchen, Jessie in charge of protein and Clara handling vegetables. They'd drink wine and talk about their days, really talk, not just the surface stuff. Jessie would tell her about the project he was working on, get animated about it in a way that made Clara smile even when she didn't fully understand what he was talking about. She'd vent about her boss or about a difficult client, and Jessie would listen and ask questions, and somehow always knew when she wanted advice versus when she just needed to complain. Other nights they'd order in and watch TV, Clara's feet in Jessie's lap, him absently rubbing her ankles while they argued about what show to watch next. They binged entire series in weekends, stayed up too late getting invested in characters and plot lines. Jessie would fall asleep first sometimes, and Clara would watch him, this person who'd chosen to be with her, who'd built a life with her, and feel this overwhelming gratitude. Weekends were for sleeping in and exploring the city. They'd find new restaurants, little hole-in-the-wall places that Jessie would somehow always know about. They'd walk through parks holding hands, stop at farmers' markets, and buy vegetables they'd forget to use. They'd wander through bookstores, and Jessie would buy her books he thought she'd like, and he was always right. They'd go to museums on rainy days, and Jessie would make up ridiculous backstories for the paintings that would make Clara laugh so hard the guards would shush them. There was this one Sunday, maybe 3 months after they'd moved in together. They woke up late and Jessie made pancakes, real pancakes from scratch with blueberries. They ate them in bed and got syrup on the sheets and didn't care. Then they spent the afternoon just existing together. Clara read a book while Jessie did some work on his laptop. No pressure to fill the silence or constantly entertain each other, just comfortable. At one point, Clara looked up from her book and watched Jessie for a minute. He was frowning at his screen, that little crease between his eyebrows that showed up when he was concentrating. His hair was messy from sleeping. He was wearing an old t-shirt and sweatpants, and Clara thought he'd never looked better. She said his name, and when he looked up, she almost told him she loved him. The words were right there, but she got nervous and just smiled and went back to her book. Jessie told her first, about a week later. They were walking home from dinner, one of those perfect early fall nights where the air was just cool enough to be comfortable. Jessie stopped walking suddenly and Clara turned to ask what was wrong, and he just said it. Said he was in love with her. Said he'd known for a while but was waiting for the right moment, and then realized there was no right moment. He just needed to tell her. Clara kissed him right there on the sidewalk, told him she loved him too, and for once in her life, she didn't have that nagging doubt in the back of her mind. She believed it, believed they were building something real and good and lasting. Then came the engagement. Jessie proposed on a random Tuesday, which Clara loved because it wasn't some big production. They were cooking dinner together, something they did most weeknights. Clara was chopping vegetables for a stir-fry, and she was telling Jessie about this argument she'd had with a coworker about proper email etiquette. She was getting worked up about it, waving her knife around while she talked, and Jessie was laughing at her. Then suddenly he wasn't laughing anymore. He was just looking at her with this expression Clara couldn't quite read. She asked if he was okay, and he said yeah, he was more than okay. He said he'd had this whole plan for how he was going to propose. Was going to take her somewhere romantic, maybe back to the park where they'd had their first date, make it this whole thing. But standing there in their kitchen, watching her get passionate about email signatures, he realized he didn't want to wait. Jessie turned off the stove so nothing would burn and Clara put down her knife, confused about what was happening. Then he started talking about how she made everything better. How even the boring stuff like grocery shopping or doing laundry felt fun when they did it together. How he wanted to spend the rest of his life with her, wanted to build a future with her, wanted to wake up next to her when they were old and gray and still arguing about stupid stuff. He pulled out this ring from his pocket and got down on one knee right there in their kitchen, and Clara's hands flew to her mouth. The ring was exactly her style, simple and elegant, a single stone on a thin band. Not too flashy, not too plain. Perfect. Jessie asked her to marry him and his voice cracked a little and Clara said yes before he even finished the question. She pulled him up and kissed him and they both started laughing because this was so them. No fancy restaurant, no public proposal, just the two of them in their kitchen with half-chopped vegetables on the counter. Jessie slipped the ring on her finger, and it fit perfectly, and Clara asked when he'd gotten it. He said he'd been carrying it around for 2 weeks waiting for the right moment. Clara said this was the right moment. They didn't end up finishing dinner. They ordered pizza instead and called their families and friends to tell them the news. Clara's mom cried, told her how happy she was for her. Jessie's parents wanted to meet her properly, have them over for dinner. Clara's best friend screamed so loud Clara had to hold the phone away from her ear. Planning the wedding was surprisingly easy. Clara had never been the type to dream about her wedding day, and Jessie didn't care about the details as long as they ended up married at the end of it. They both wanted something small and meaningful, just close friends and family. No stress, no drama, just a celebration. They found this venue outside the city, this place with a garden and string lights and an area for an outdoor ceremony. The woman who ran it was sweet and helpful without being pushy. They booked it for the following spring, giving them about 8 months to plan. Clara's mom went with her to try on dresses. Clara tried on maybe 5 before she found the one. It was simple, fitted but not too tight, with delicate lace on the sleeves. When she looked in the mirror, she didn't feel like she was playing dress-up or pretending to be someone she wasn't. She felt like herself, just a slightly fancier version. Her mom cried when she tried it on, and the saleswoman had to get her tissues. Jesse's dad gave this toast at the rehearsal dinner that made everyone tear up. He talked about how he'd never seen his son happier, how he could tell just by watching them together that they'd found something special. He said marriage wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it, and he could tell they had what it took to make it work. The wedding itself was beautiful in this understated way. It was a perfect spring day, warm but not too hot, with a light breeze that kept things comfortable. The ceremony was outside, chairs set up in neat rows, flowers everywhere, those string lights Clara had loved strung up overhead even though they wouldn't turn on until later. Clara walked down the aisle to acoustic guitar, her mom on one side and her stepdad on the other. She kept her eyes on Jesse the whole time, and he was smiling so wide. When she got to him, he whispered that she looked beautiful, and she whispered back that he cleaned up nice. They'd written their own vows, something Clara had been nervous about because she wasn't good with words like that. But standing there in front of everyone they loved, it felt natural. She promised to be his partner, his best friend, his person. Promised to laugh with him and cry with him and grow with him. Promised to choose him every day, even on the hard days. When Jesse said his vows, his voice cracked a little. He promised to love her exactly as she was, to support her dreams, to make her coffee in the morning and hold her at night. He promised to work through problems instead of running from them, to build a life with her that they were both proud of. Clara had to wipe her eyes before she could say I do. The reception was relaxed and fun. Good food, good music, people dancing and laughing. Jesse's college friends told embarrassing stories about him. Clara's best friend gave a toast about how she'd watched Clara close herself off for years and how amazing it was to see her open up and let someone in. Jesse and Clara had their first dance to a song they both loved, and Jesse whispered jokes in her ear the whole time to keep her from getting too nervous about everyone watching them. The honeymoon was 2 weeks in Italy, something they'd saved up for. They started in Rome. Overwhelmed by the history and the crowds and the sheer amount of things to see. They wandered through the Colosseum holding hands, threw coins in the Trevi fountain, ate gelato 3 times a day because they couldn't help themselves. Jesse tried to speak Italian using a phrase book, and the locals would smile indulgently and respond in English. They took a train to Florence and stayed in this tiny hotel room that barely fit the bed, but it had a window that opened onto the street, and they could hear people talking and laughing below. They spent days walking until their feet hurt, visiting museums and churches, getting lost in narrow streets, and not caring because getting lost meant discovering new things. They found this little restaurant that wasn't in any guidebook, just stumbled across it, and the owner sat with them and told them about his family while pouring them wine. They stayed until the owners gently kicked them out, stumbled back to their little bed and breakfast laughing about nothing, fell into bed still wearing their clothes. Clara remembered thinking she wanted to remember this forever. This feeling, this night, this person next to her who made everything feel like an adventure. On their last night, they had dinner at the hotel restaurant, something fancy that they definitely couldn't afford but decided to splurge on anyway. They talked about going back to real life, to their jobs and their apartment and their regular routine. Jesse said he was excited to just be married to her, to have the regular boring days together. Clara said she felt the same way. They'd had this amazing honeymoon, but what she was really looking forward to was building a life together. When they got back home, life settled into married life, and it was good, different from before in small ways, better in others. Clara would catch herself sometimes just watching him, thinking about how lucky she was, how different this was from everything that came before. She'd made it. She'd found someone who loved her, who chose her, who wanted to build a life with her. Jesse seemed happy too. He'd come home from work and kiss her hello, ask about her day, tell her about his. They'd fall into their routine of cooking together, eating dinner while watching shows, doing dishes side by side. On weekends, they'd run errands together, make breakfast, sometimes just stay in bed reading or talking. It felt settled and comfortable in the best way. For months, everything was blissful. They talked about maybe buying a house in a year or two, about whether they wanted kids, and if so, when, about growing old together. Clara felt secure in a way she never had before, like she'd finally left that old version of herself behind, the one who made bad choices and hurt people. This was her second chance, and she was doing it right. But then things started feeling off. Nothing she could point to exactly at first, just this sense that something had shifted. Jessie seemed distracted sometimes, would zone out during conversations, and she'd have to repeat herself. He started working late more often, coming home after she was already in bed. When she'd ask about his day, his answers got vaguer. He was on his phone more, angling it away from her in a way he never used to. Clara tried to ignore it at first, told herself she was being paranoid, projecting her past onto her present. But the feeling wouldn't go away. It got stronger. She'd wake up in the middle of the night and he'd be in the living room on his laptop, and when she asked what he was doing, he'd say work stuff and close it too quickly. He started picking fights over small things, like he was creating distance on purpose. So she did something she swore she'd never do. She started snooping. And God, she hated herself for it, but she couldn't shake this feeling that something was very wrong. She checked his phone one morning while he was in the shower. Her hands were shaking and her heart was pounding, and she almost didn't do it. Almost put it back down and chose to trust him. But she didn't, and what she found destroyed her. Messages to multiple women, flirty texts, explicit photos, meet-up plans, and it wasn't recent. It went back months. Years, actually. She scrolled and scrolled, her stomach twisting tighter with each message. He'd been cheating on her their entire relationship. Before they moved in together, during their engagement, on their honeymoon, after their wedding. All of it. Every single moment she thought was real, he'd been lying. Clara spiraled. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, could barely function. But she didn't confront him. Not yet. Because something about it felt wrong in a way that went beyond just cheating. The messages were too calculated, too smooth. Jessie had always been charming, but this was different. It felt rehearsed. So she did something extreme. She hired a private investigator. She needed to know everything. Who these women were, how long it had been going on, if there was more she didn't know about. The pie was expensive, but Clara didn't care. She needed the truth, all of it. 3 weeks. That's how long she waited while the pie dug into Jessie's life. 3 weeks of pretending everything was normal, of kissing him goodbye in the morning and asking about his day at night, of lying in bed next to him while her mind raced. She got good at faking it. Too good, maybe. When the pie finally called her in, Clara thought she was prepared for whatever he'd found. She wasn't. The pie laid out photos, documents, a whole timeline. But the worst part, the part that made Clara feel like the floor had dropped out from under her, was this. Jessie wasn't even his real name. He was an actor, a hired actor. Everything about him, their entire relationship, had been a performance. Someone had paid him to do this. To meet her, charm her, make her fall in love with him, marry her, and then break her heart in the most devastating way possible. This wasn't just cheating. This was revenge. Clara felt like she couldn't breathe. An actor. She'd married an actor who was literally playing a role. Every kiss, every laugh, every promise, every moment she thought they were building something real, he was just doing a job. She wanted to throw up. She wanted to scream. She wanted to disappear. But more than anything, she wanted to know who. Who hated her enough to do this? Who had the money and the motivation to orchestrate something this cruel and this elaborate? When she finally confronted Jessie, she was calm in a way that scared her. She'd practiced what she was going to say, how she was going to handle it. She told him she knew. Knew about the women, knew about the lies, knew that he was an actor. And she asked him point blank why he did it. Jessie didn't even try to deny it. He just looked at her with this expression that wasn't quite apologetic but wasn't cruel either, more like resigned. He told her his job with her was done, just like that. His job was done. He'd been hired to make her fall in love with him, marry her, and then let her discover the truth in the worst possible way. Clara asked who hired him. Jessie said he couldn't tell her that, but if she wanted to know why, she could go to the offices of Taberdoe Enterprises and ask for Betty Taberdoe. Then he packed a bag and left. Just walked out of their apartment, out of her life, like the last 2.5 years had been nothing. Because to him, they had been nothing. Clara sat in the empty apartment for hours. Betty Taberdoe. The name didn't mean anything to her at first, but then she started searching online and the pieces started falling into place. Betty Taberdoe was the CEO of Taberdoe Enterprises, a massive conglomerate with interests in everything from real estate to tech. She was powerful, wealthy, and according to the articles Clara found, brilliant in business. But that wasn't what made Clara's blood run cold. It was the photos, Betty in various articles, at business events and charity galas. And in some of the older photos before she became CEO, there was a man next to her. Her husband, Kevin. Kevin, Clara remembered him. One of the married men from those 2 years. She'd been with him for maybe 3 months. He'd been one of the ones who wanted to leave his wife for her, and she'd shut him down hard. Told him she didn't want him, that he was just a distraction. She'd ended it and never thought about him again. But apparently Betty had thought about Clara. A lot. Clara spent days trying to decide if she should actually go to Betty's office. Part of her wanted to just disappear, change her name, move across the country, pretend none of this ever happened. But another part of her needed to face this, needed to understand what she'd done to deserve this level of revenge. So she made an appointment, used her real name, said she was there to see Betty Tabordeau on a personal matter. She half expected to be turned away, but the assistant just nodded and said Betty was expecting her. The elevator ride up to the executive floor felt like it took forever. Clara had rehearsed what she was going to say, but her mind went blank as she walked down the hallway to Betty's office. The door was already open. Betty was standing by the window, looking out over the city. She was smaller than Clara expected, maybe 5'4", with dark hair pulled back in a neat bun. She wore a perfectly tailored suit, and when she turned around, her expression was calm, almost pleasant. "Clara," Betty said, like they were old friends. "I wondered when you'd come." Clara didn't know what to say. She'd expected anger, maybe gloating, but Betty just gestured to a chair and sat down across from her. They were separated by this massive desk, but somehow the space felt intimate in a way that made Clara uncomfortable. "You want to know why," Betty said. It wasn't a question. Clara nodded. Her voice felt stuck in her throat. Betty leaned back in her chair, and for the first time, Clara saw something in her eyes. Not anger exactly, more like exhaustion. "Kevin was my husband for 12 years. Did you know that?" Clara shook her head. "No, I suppose you wouldn't have cared," Betty said, but her tone wasn't accusatory, just factual. "Let me tell you about Kevin, about us, because I think you should know what you destroyed." And then Betty told her everything. Kevin came into Betty's life when she was 24. She was working at her father's company, starting from the bottom like he'd insisted. Junior employee, no special treatment, nobody knowing she was the boss's daughter. She wanted to earn her place, prove herself on her own merit. Kevin was in the finance department, had been there for a couple years already. He was good at his job, ambitious, funny. He had this way of making everyone around him feel important. They became friends first, would grab coffee together, vent about difficult clients, bond over their shared love of terrible action movies. It took 6 months before Kevin asked her out, and even then he was nervous about it. Thought it might mess up their friendship. Betty said yes anyway. Their relationship grew slowly, deliberately. Kevin was patient in a way Betty wasn't used to. He didn't push, didn't demand more than she was ready to give. He met her friends. He fit into her life like he'd always been there. 3 years in, he proposed. Nothing fancy, just the two of them on a walk through the park they'd been going to since their first date. He had this simple gold band, said it was all he could afford, but he wanted to marry her anyway. And that's when Betty knew she had to tell him the truth. She stopped him before he could finish the proposal and said she needed to confess something. That she wasn't just some junior employee. That her father owned the company. That she was the heir to everything. Betty said Kevin looked at the ring in his hand and said he was sorry. And for a second, her heart stopped. She thought he was upset about the ring, embarrassed that it wasn't expensive enough. But then he looked at her and asked if she was okay with him not knowing, if she could forgive him for not realizing who she was. She asked if he was okay with her being an heir, with everything that came with that. He said yes, so she said yes to him. They got married 4 months later. Betty's voice got softer as she talked about their marriage. They were happy, she said, really happy. Kevin continued working at the company, but in a different division to avoid conflicts of interest. They bought a house in the suburbs, something with a yard because Kevin wanted space to garden. He'd come home from work and spend hours outside, getting dirt under his nails, growing tomatoes and herbs. When Betty's father retired and she took over as CEO, Kevin was her biggest supporter. He'd listen to her stress about board meetings and difficult decisions, would remind her to eat when she got too caught up in work. They'd have these Sunday morning routines where they'd sleep in, make pancakes, read the paper together. Simple stuff that felt important. They had 2 kids, a daughter first, then a son 2 years later. Kevin was an amazing father, patient, present, genuinely excited about every milestone. He coached their daughter's soccer team, helped their son build elaborate Lego cities, read bedtime stories with different voices for every character. Betty would sometimes stand in the doorway of the kids' rooms and watch him with them, feeling this overwhelming gratitude that this was her life. 12 years, they'd been married for 12 years. The kids were 10 and 8. They just started talking about maybe taking a big family trip to Japan the next summer. Life was good, stable. Betty had built her career, Kevin had his, their kids were thriving. They'd made it work in a way that felt rare and precious. And then one night, Betty found out about Clara. She wasn't even looking for anything. Kevin had left his laptop open on the kitchen table, which wasn't unusual. But Betty needed to look something up and her phone was upstairs, so she sat down to use his computer. A message popped up. Just a notification, but it was enough. Something flirty, intimate, from a name Betty didn't recognize. She should have closed it, should have asked Kevin about it, but she didn't. She clicked through to the messages, and then to others. Different women, different conversations, but Clara's name kept coming up the most. Clara this, Clara that, plans to meet up. Kevin talking about how Betty didn't understand him, how things at home were complicated, how he needed something different. Betty sat at that kitchen table for hours, reading through months of messages. The kids were asleep upstairs. Kevin was at a business dinner, and Betty's entire world was falling apart in real time. When Kevin came home, Betty was still sitting there. She didn't yell, didn't cry, didn't throw things. She just asked him if it was true, if he'd been cheating on her. Kevin tried to deny it at first, but Betty pulled up the messages on his laptop and watched his face crumble. Then came the excuses. He was stressed. He made a mistake. It didn't mean anything. He loved Betty. He loved their family. But when Betty asked him to name the women, he couldn't even remember all of them. Clara, though. He remembered Clara, said she was different. That he'd wanted to leave Betty for her, but Clara had said no. That's what broke Betty. Not that Kevin had cheated, but that he'd wanted to leave her and their kids for some woman who didn't even want him. That their 12 years together, their children, their life, had meant so little to him that he'd been willing to throw it all away. Betty told Kevin to leave. That night. Didn't matter that it was late or that the kids were sleeping. She wanted him out of the house. He tried to argue, to ask for another chance, but Betty was done. She filed for divorce the next morning. She also fired him from the company. Not immediately, that would have looked personal. But she restructured his division, made his position redundant, gave him a severance package and sent him on his way. It was all legal, all by the book, but Kevin knew what it was. Betty was erasing him from every part of her life. The divorce was brutal. Kevin fought for custody, but Betty had resources he didn't. She got primary custody of the kids, the house, everything. Kevin moved into an apartment across town, got a new job that paid less, started dating other women almost immediately, like he needed to prove something. Betty threw herself into work, expanded the company, took on bigger projects, made more money than ever before. People praised her for being so strong, so resilient. But at night, alone in the house that used to be theirs, she'd feel this rage burning inside her that wouldn't go away. Because Kevin was stupid. That's what she kept coming back to. He'd destroyed their family for nothing. For women who didn't care about him, for an affair that Clara had ended without a second thought. Betty had given him everything. A good life, a loving family, a career. And he'd thrown it away for someone who saw him as disposable. But Betty's rage wasn't really at Kevin. He was weak, selfish, immature. She'd accepted that. Her rage was at Clara, because Clara had to have known. Had to have known Kevin was married, that he had a family, and she'd slept with him anyway. Maybe Clara didn't owe Betty anything, they'd never met. But there was still a choice Clara made, and that choice had consequences. So Betty started planning. She didn't want to hurt Clara physically. That wasn't her style. She wanted Clara to feel what Betty had felt. The betrayal, the humiliation, the gut-wrenching realization that the person you trusted most had been lying to you all along. It took Betty 6 months to find the right person. She went through agencies that specialized in unconventional services, the kind that existed in a legal gray area. She interviewed several candidates before she found Jesse, or whatever his real name was. He was perfect for it. Good-looking, charming, believable. An actual trained actor who'd done some commercial work but was looking for something more lucrative. Betty paid him well, very well, enough to make it worth his time to commit to a long con. She gave him a profile on Clara, information about what she liked, how she thought, what kind of man she'd fall for. Jesse did the rest. Betty monitored the whole thing from a distance. She knew when they started dating, when they moved in together, when Jesse proposed. She saw the wedding photos that Clara posted on social media, looking so happy and in love. And Betty felt nothing but cold satisfaction. She waited until they'd been married for several months, until Clara had settled into married life, felt secure, felt like she'd won. Then Betty gave Jesse the signal to let Clara find out the truth, not all at once. Slowly, like Betty's discovery. Let Clara start to suspect, start to doubt. Let her confront Jesse and find out it was all a lie. Let her feel that special kind of devastation that comes from realizing you never knew the person you married at all. Betty sat back in her chair, finished with her story. Clara had listened to all of it in silence, her face pale. "You destroyed my family," Betty said simply. "So I destroyed your marriage, seems fair to me." Clara's voice came out hoarse. "I didn't know he had kids." "Would it have mattered?" Betty asked, not accusatory, genuinely curious. Clara wanted to say yes, wanted to believe she had some line she wouldn't cross. But the truth was, back then, she probably wouldn't have cared. She'd been so focused on protecting herself, on not getting hurt, that she hadn't thought about who else might get hurt in the process. "I'm sorry," Clara said, and she meant it. "I know that doesn't fix anything, but I'm sorry." Betty studied her for a long moment. "Are you sorry you did it, or sorry you got caught?" "Both," Clara admitted, because that was the truth. She was sorry she'd been with Kevin, sorry she'd been the kind of person who thought married men were safer than single ones. But she was also devastated by what Jesse, what Betty had done to her. And she didn't know how to hold both of those things at once. "My kids ask about their father," Betty said quietly. "They want to know why he doesn't live with us anymore. They're too young to understand the real reason, so I tell them it's complicated. But they blame themselves sometimes. Think they did something wrong. Do you know what that's like? Watching your children hurt because of something you had no control over." Clara shook her head. She didn't have kids, didn't know that specific pain. "Kevin was weak," Betty continued. "He made the choice to cheat, to risk everything we'd built. That's on him, but you were part of it, you enabled it, and I needed you to understand what that felt like from the other side." "I do now," Clara said, and she did. She understood the betrayal, the anger, the feeling of being made a fool. She understood why Betty had done this, even if she thought it was cruel. Maybe especially because it was cruel. They sat in silence for a while. Outside, the city hummed along, oblivious to the two women in this office dealing with the wreckage of their choices. Finally, Betty spoke again. "I'm not proud of what I did. I won't pretend I am. Revenge doesn't feel as good as you think it will. I thought it would make me feel better, make me feel like I got even. But it didn't. I still wake up alone. My kids still miss their father. The company's doing great, but I go home to an empty house and it feels hollow." Clara looked at her, really looked at her. Betty wasn't some villain. She was just a woman who'd been hurt and had lashed out in the only way she knew how, with money and power and careful planning. But underneath all that, she was still just hurt. "What happens now?" Clara asked. Betty shrugged. "Nothing. There's nothing left to happen. You know the truth. I've said what I needed to say. You can leave." But Clara didn't get up. "Do you regret it?" "Every day," Betty said. "But I'd probably do it again. That's the worst part. Knowing it didn't help, didn't fix anything, but still feeling like you deserved it." "Maybe I did," Clara said softly. Maybe you did, Betty agreed. But that doesn't mean I should have been the one to give it to you. Clara stood up slowly. Her legs felt shaky, like they might give out. For what it's worth, I stopped, sleeping with married men. I stopped years before I met Jesse. I thought I'd changed. Had you? Betty asked. Clara thought about it, really thought about it. I don't know. I stopped doing the thing, but I don't know if I ever actually dealt with why I did it in the first place. I just convinced myself I was different because I wasn't actively hurting people anymore. But I never made amends, never tried to understand the damage I'd caused. Betty nodded. That's honest, at least. Clara walked to the door, then turned back. Your kids, they're lucky to have you. Even if things are hard right now, they have a mom who fought for them. That matters. Betty's expression softened just slightly. Thank you. Clara left the office, rode the elevator down, walked out onto the street. The world looked the same as it had when she'd gone in, but she felt completely different. Hollowed out and raw, but also strangely clear. Like she'd been living in a fog and someone had finally turned on a light. She went home to the apartment she'd shared with Jesse. It didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a stage set, every piece of furniture a prop, every memory a performance she'd believed was real. She started packing. Not everything, just the essentials. Clothes, important documents, a few things that had been hers before Jesse. She called her mom, told her a version of what happened. Her mom cried and offered to come stay with her, but Clara said no. She needed to figure this out on her own. She found a new apartment, something small and cheap on the other side of the city. Started the process of annulling the marriage, which was complicated by the fact that Jesse wasn't even who he said he was. The legal stuff was a nightmare. Turned out Jesse's real name was Marcus Reeves, and he'd falsified documents to marry her. That made the marriage invalid, which should have made Clara feel better but somehow made it worse. She'd married a ghost, a person who didn't exist. Clara started therapy. Real therapy, not just talking to friends over wine. She found someone who specialized in trauma and betrayal, and she showed up every week even when she didn't want to. Especially when she didn't want to. The therapist asked her hard questions about her past, about why she'd spent 2 years sleeping with married men, about what she was running from. It turned out Clara had a lot she was running from. An absent father who'd cheated on her mom repeatedly before finally leaving when Clara was 12. A string of relationships in her teens and early 20s where she'd been cheated on, left, discarded. She decided somewhere along the way that if she was going to get hurt, she might as well control it. Married men were safe because they couldn't actually leave their wives for her. She could end it whenever she wanted and walk away first. But that logic had hurt other people. People like Betty. People like Betty's kids. And Clara had to sit with that. Had to acknowledge that her pain didn't excuse the pain she'd caused. Months passed. Clara got used to living alone, to being single, to not trusting anyone. She quit her job because too many people knew about Jesse, about the marriage, and the whispers and pitying looks were too much. She found work as a freelancer, something she could do from home without having to explain herself to anyone. She thought about Betty sometimes, wondered if Betty thought about her, wondered if destroying Clara's marriage had given Betty any peace, or if she was still angry, still hurt, still waking up in an empty house wishing things were different. A year after their meeting, Clara did something she'd been thinking about for months. She wrote Betty a letter. Not an email, an actual handwritten letter. She didn't apologize again because she'd already done that and it hadn't meant much. Instead, she told Betty what she was doing to change. The therapy, the work she was putting in to understand herself and her patterns. She acknowledged that it didn't undo the damage, but she wanted Betty to know that the revenge had landed. That Clara wasn't the same person anymore. She didn't expect a response and she didn't get one, but somehow, sending the letter felt important. Like she was closing a chapter, or at least trying to. Betty did read the letter, though Clara never knew that. She read it 3 times, sitting in her office late one night after everyone else had gone home. And then she filed it away in a drawer and tried not to think about it. But she did think about it. She thought about Clara trying to change, trying to be better. She thought about her own revenge and whether it had been worth it. The answer was still no. It hadn't fixed anything, hadn't made her feel better, hadn't brought Kevin back or repaired her family. It had just created more pain, more damage, spreading the hurt instead of containing it. Betty's kids were doing okay. They were resilient in the way kids are, adapting to their new normal. They saw Kevin every other weekend, and he was trying to be a better father even if he'd been a terrible husband. Betty had started dating again, casually, nothing serious. She'd learned to be alone without feeling lonely most of the time. She thought about responding to Clara's letter, but she didn't know what she'd say. That she forgave her. She didn't, not really. That she regretted the revenge. She did, but that didn't help anyone. So she left it alone, and the silence became its own kind of response. Time kept moving forward because that's what time does. Clara continued therapy, continued working on herself. She started volunteering at a women's shelter, helping women who'd been in abusive relationships rebuild their lives. It felt like penance in a way, but it also felt right. Like she was using her understanding of manipulation and betrayal for something good. She went on a few dates here and there, but nothing serious. She wasn't ready for that, might not be ready for a long time, and that was okay. She was learning to be alone with herself, to face her own thoughts and feelings without running from them or burying them in someone else. Betty kept building her company, kept raising her kids, kept moving forward. The anger faded slowly, replaced by something closer to acceptance. Kevin had betrayed her, Clara had been part of it, and Betty had hurt Clara in return. None of it could be undone. All they could do was figure out how to live with what had happened. 2 years after their meeting, Betty saw Clara at a charity event. Pure coincidence, Clara was there with the shelter she volunteered at. They made eye contact across the room, and for a moment, neither of them knew what to do. Then Betty gave a small nod, and Clara nodded back. No words, no confrontation, no forgiveness, just an acknowledgement. We both did things we regret. We both hurt people. We're both trying to move forward. That was all it was. A moment, and then they went their separate ways. Because some things don't get wrapped up neatly. Some wounds don't fully heal. You just learn to live with the scars and try to be better than you were. Both of them were trying, in their own ways. Clara by facing what she'd done and working to change. Betty by letting go of the anger that had consumed her and finding a way to be whole again. The story doesn't have a happy ending, but it has an honest one. Clara learned that running from pain by causing pain doesn't work. Betty learned that revenge doesn't heal wounds, it just creates new ones. And both of them learned that the only person you can really change is yourself. That's the thing about consequences. They catch up with you eventually. Maybe not in the way you expect, maybe not from the direction you're watching, but they come. And when they do, you have two choices. You can let them destroy you, or you can let them teach you. Clara chose to learn. Betty chose to let go. And maybe that's not a happy ending, but it's a real one. They're both still working on it, still figuring out how to be the people they want to be instead of the people their pain made them. Because healing isn't about forgetting what happened or pretending it didn't hurt. It's about acknowledging the damage, taking responsibility for your part in it, and deciding to do better going forward. Some days are harder than others. Some days the past feels so heavy it's hard to move, but they keep going anyway. And somewhere in all of that, there's hope. Not that everything will be okay, because some things can't be fixed, but that they can both be okay anyway. That they can both find peace, find purpose, find a way to live with what happened and who they were and who they're trying to become. The story ends there, but their stories don't. They keep living, keep changing, keep becoming. And maybe that's the point. Not that there's some final destination where everything makes sense and all the pain goes away, but that you can keep moving forward anyway, carrying your scars and your lessons and your hope for something better. You are allowed to have caused pain and still deserve healing. You are allowed to have been hurt and still need to take responsibility. Life isn't simple, people aren't simple, and healing definitely isn't simple. But it's possible. It's always possible. That's what both Clara and Betty learned eventually. Not that they could undo the past, but that they could build a future anyway. Different than what they'd planned, shaped by their mistakes and their choices, but theirs nonetheless. And sometimes that's enough.